Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Corporate Underground. We have Warwick joining us again this week. Thank you so much. And our topic of choice is why is Australia the driest continent professionally? Not to do with rainfall, but people's profession and how they lack innovation or even looking outside what they studied, what their first job was. They just work that corporate ladder instead of trying new things. So why don't you give us a bit more depth to this topic that you've chosen to talk about this week?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. It's interesting. We're about 10 days away from COP26, the climate conference over in Glasgow. And you said it, right? We are the driest nation. We are the hottest continent in the world, which means we can export renewable energy, and we still haven't done it. Yet we created solar. We created solar like 50 years ago, right? So I'm baffled by our lack of innovation and our lack of exponential thinking and lateral thinking, right? I think my point comes from way back in my early days in my career. I rocked into London and I was headhunting for McKinsey and Company and UBS and all these types of organizations. And so we had to go and find the best talent. But the best talent wasn't what is considered the best talent here. The best talent here was, if you're recruiting for a law firm or a Big Four or these types of folk, you did commerce law at Melbourne Uni. You did engineering commerce at the University of Sydney. Whereas over there, to get into a UBS, you'd have someone who studied English literature and biomedical science, right? Like so you would end up with just this nucleus of diversity in these teams where folks came from the arts, they came from commerce, they came from science, they came from engineering, and you had this cluster of divergent thinking, which then created much more creativity. So I think, if you look at Australia, we've had 30 years of economic growth, but it's predominantly come from two things. One is digging more holes, and the other is a reserve bank that has just propped the housing market up through negative gearing, right? So it's they call it a two-speed economy, and arguably it is. So I've been thinking for a couple of years now. We need something like an impact X curve type thinking, right? We need to go from that linear sort of thinking to lateral thinking. And then on top of that, we need to go from this sort of business as usual thinking to exponential thinking, right? We've got two massive tectonic plates happening right now. One is diversity in terms of intergenerational diversity. And what are these? Gen Z is the largest consumer group in the world. Gen Y is more than 50% of the global workforce, which grows to 75% in just 4 years' time. 75% of the workforce are millennials in just 4 years' time. Right? How do we unlock all of that talent versus this business as usual thinking that doesn't take into the equation that compounding growth of the tech sector and artificial intelligence and all these new emerging technologies, right? So I think we just need to really think differently and understand that we can be a powerful economy. We can supply the whole of Asia with all of our goods and services if we don't just simply stick in these straight lines that we've created for ourselves.
I don't disagree with what you've said. My experience of the UK was slightly different, and most of the people that had jobs that were creative, and I take your point, they did do that, but they all seemed to have their jobs through relationships. They had fathers or mothers that were in certain points that got them roles that they were doing completely something else, and it sort of then brought that in, which I don't disagree with. I actually think it isn't a bad thing to be assisted by others, that to actually be able to go and do something else but then come into the fore. In Australia, I don't see that as much, that kind of generational, somebody's been a lord for 10 years or whatever, that sort of gets migrated. I see a bigger problem with our collaboration in Australia. We're at the bottom. of collaboration. I see we're at the bottom of schools and business actually integrating and actually passing across and working on those things together. Now, where you look in the UK, the school and the business are almost combined because they've been going for that much longer. There's this sort of a legacy between businesses. You look at MIT and America and different places, they've looked at business and school and sort of put those things together. We haven't. We fight amongst everything and ourselves to stop anybody getting up. We're like a bucket of mud crabs. Anybody starts to get ahead, we pull them down. Now, I think collaboration comes a lot more with taking time to get to know people and actually understanding that and building stronger relationships. The collaborations that I've done with Ronan and Tony, the things that I've done with Finbar, and you're working with Finbar, it's taken time. You build relationships with people and then actually bring other people in that they are also trusted. Then you take that on. I don't see that working in Australia as much. We seem to be in a rush to get wherever we're going. And I think that's affecting how our thought processes is. If you look at the Asian powers, they all take a long time thinking. You know, China's thinking 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years. We're thinking 5 minutes. Is that because we're an immigrant nation? Like, is that because we haven't found our place yet?
I also think it's a virtue of the economy in which we operate, right? So when you've got 4 banks, 3 energy companies, and 2 food grocers all fighting over a 25 million piece of pie, that's very constrained thinking. And those organizations collectively together hire a huge amount of people. And the media is so engrossed in what those organizations do that we're unable to think differently, right? So I think by the nature of those organizations being brutally combative, then that permeates across the economies in which we operate. The fact that even our dear friend George at Paul's Festival is having states fiercely now compete for what is the best creative business event in Asia Pacific, definitely in Australia, if not Asia Pacific. Now they're all competing. You've got to ask the question, who's coming up with a solution that says, hey, Sydney and New South Wales investment, why don't you guys run 2 days? Then let's take it over to WA and bring in the closest proximity to Asia market. So then we can bring over some of the Singaporeans into WA. Then we bring it into Melbourne. And of course, we've got our own bubbling, thriving ecosystem. But then Melbourne has the strongest relationships with China, with New Zealand, etc. Right? And we can create. Who's thinking like that? They're all just going, New South Wales wants it. South Australia wants it. Victoria wants to bring it back. That's just one example. But the fact that
it's a good example.
Organizations,
it's a great example, but you bring up New Zealand there, right? And they are even smaller in stature than with 4 million people. You know, each of the banks are from Australia. There's one power company, if you like, but they seem to have a lot more imagination. They have a lot more creativity. They work in these things with a lot more collaboration, where they see themselves as having to go. They're like the island of the Southern Pacific, you know, where Ireland was the tiger going into Europe. So I don't know whether it is size. I think it is a mindset that comes through. I don't think it is, you know, monopolies that have. I do see your point. I absolutely understand what you're saying. But then if I look at New Zealand, they don't seem to be having those same issues, but they should have even more so. So what's the break with that thinking? And I'm not just New Zealand, Australia. I don't want to get into that ridiculousness. But I mean, like, you see Singapore, or you against Malaysia, or there's certain countries that just seem to get their shit together, that take on well above their weight to take something on. I mean, where do you think that comes from?
I'm gonna chip into this. I'm not originally from Australia. I think it's kind of the big fish in a small pond. I think New Zealand, they're small enough to want to sort of break out of that. Australia's big enough. It's got this ecosystem, and so they're happy to be a big fish in a small pond. And by that, there's a certain amount of ego in that, in the fact that we were talking about this a few months ago. Everyone says, you get 4 people in a room, say in construction, they go, oh yeah, we'd all love to collaborate as long as you do it my way. And that applies to the States, you know. We'd all love to have innovation, but we want to own it. not truly collaborate. And there's an attachment of ego to that. Oh, New South Wales have won this, or Victoria owns that. And by owning a big piece of something or thinking you own it, you then create that mindset around you that it's a deficit if someone takes it away from you, rather than sharing it and getting a bigger piece of the pie.
Exactly right, and that's exactly the thought process we need to shift towards. Right, if the pie is only 25 million people, then yes, 4 organisations can only have a slice of it. But if we create a bigger pie, then we can collaborate, right? And if we co-create products together, we can take into other markets, right? Like, I think that's the whole thinking needs to shift around. The pie can get bigger. We don't have to just the pie isn't fixed, and so I think that's where our thinking needs to shift.
I'll take your point on that one exactly. I mean, like, one of the things that I feel is a very wise friend who exports a lot, he does a lot. He said most companies that he works with think locally and then try and go globally. The difference with his success is he goes, I go globally first and I'm always more successful locally. Because he's thinking globally, the local market looks after itself. But for most people, they go, let's sort out Australia before I look to Asia. Well, that's not your market. It never would be. It needs to expand better. So it's that thought process of, what have I got to do? There's a company that we have worked with a little bit, and they work on Australia's, I mean, I'll put it bluntly, racism. They go and say, we will look and book all these things for you in Asia or India or whatever you need made or printed. You could do it yourself, but you go, well, yeah, I don't trust those people. I trust you to do that for me. And they're making a lot of money and working really, really hard and do it really, really smart by taking advantage of that, by actually saying, look, we will look at in China. We will look after you in Japan. We'll do this. Well, you could do that yourself, but you're going, well, I don't know that. I don't want to know that. I don't want to make those connections. I know what I know. And I find most people like to stay in their backyard. They don't want to expand.
There's this general, I guess, issue that, like, even if the market was bigger, like you say, like, obviously anyone can decide to sell anywhere in this modern world, but that still requires that attitude. And I feel like if you can't collaborate or innovate even in your own bloody pond, then how are you ever going to have the chance to do it in a bigger pond? And like, I remember being someone that's, owns a business. I go to obviously lots of business events, and always being young, because I started straight out of uni, over the years, there's been countless, especially the millennial, like there was this countless like business topics about millennials, right? And it'd start off positive for like 5 minutes. And then for the rest of the 50 to 80 minutes after that, it's just everyone having a whinge. Just everyone take a turn of saying how it's terrible, and they all are privileged, and they all want this and they all want that. And I feel like if you can't even figure out how to have multiple generations and satisfy them and understand them and use their ideas to grow your business, etc., then how are you ever going to do it any other way? Like, intergenerational, I feel like, is the easiest way to cross-pollinate before you even get into all other forms. But it's just this idea that I had to work hard, I had to wait 20 years before I got promoted, so everyone else should have to fight the same battle. Where, like, I'm sorry, like, if my parents had to wait till they were 40 to get their first house, why should I? Like there's this idea that because I suffered, everyone else should suffer. And that attitude, I think, is why people don't collaborate. I don't want to help you learn how to take a shortcut because I had to go through the mud, so should you. And I think that attitude is what's stopping collaboration and innovation, because it's like, well, you can't innovate if you don't collaborate, and you can't collaborate if you want everyone else to suffer because you had to.
Yeah, and I think just the complexity of business has also made it that we don't understand each other. We speak different languages, right? The millennials and the Gen Zs are probably talking about NFTs and blockchain and know how to even hack our own computers, right? Versus the folks in the boardroom are thinking about 10-year return on investment, 7 to 8% yields, and like we're just there's so much going on that even you think about the okay boomers, they've only just understood Facebook last year. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I'm going to hold you. I'm going to hold you on that. I'm going to hold you on that because I truly believe that the boomers and the millennials are almost exactly the same. Like, because the boomers were the ones that challenged all the guys before, and they were going, "You don't understand any of these processes. What do you mean you don't like Jimi Hendrix? What do you mean you don't like the Doors? What do you mean you don't like this? All you old people don't understand music. You don't take drugs. You don't want to look at Greenpeace. You don't want to save the environment. You don't want to do all this. Now you take away pretty much everything that they said when they were 20, and you put it into a millennial way of thinking. It's exactly the same. They are the same. It's just skipped my generation, and they are now the same people. And the things that you don't like are usually the things that are closest to you. The things that you don't like about your kids when they do what you do better than you, or in the same way, and it reminds you what you do know. So I think there's a really, really big proximity to those two generations, and the boomers are the biggest, followed by the millennials or the Y, and these guys could collaborate. But if we could get that to work, and I believe in networking, most of the COVID sped this up. Most people are now looking at their families and going, I want to connect more. I want to collaborate more. I'm now in my 50s what have I really achieved? I've got a friend of mine that worked in Sydney, flew up there all the time. He's been at home for a year, and he said for the first 6 months, his kids just walked around him like a rock because he hadn't been home during Monday to Friday. He says he never wants to do that again. He's quit that job and he's now working only in Melbourne, and he's home all the time so he can be part of that. And there's a big change happening right across the board, but that's happening with the people that have the power at the moment that want to change that for the younger generation. So I think there's a real big hope moving forward, but how do we connect that? Because you've got two people speaking the same thought process. They're not speaking the same language.
Yeah, I also think, and this is no doubt goes back in history around the power play, right? Like, power is something that, the thought process is you have to give some of it away for the other person to get the power, right? Whereas in this current model of collaboration, we can be more powerful together. We're not giving any power away. We're just going to be more powerful together, right? So rather than, I still think the more years you've been on the planet, the more layers of onion that there is. Sometimes we forget that these millennial kids can create Canva. They can create Airwallex and make it $1 billion in 6 years. Like, we've got to pay them respect. They took risks,
absolutely,
and they do it differently, and they think exponentially. We've got to release some of our ego and enable us to be more powerful together. I really do think that fundamentally there is and this might be because of the housing market, and I need to pay my $2.4 million mortgage. I need to stay in this job. I need to hold on to my power. Otherwise, I can't pay for this plus the 60 grand a year for the 2 kids at private school, right? So I think that whereas a millennial, on day one, I met a guy who got onto the IBM graduate program 2 years ago, an amazing young fella called Zubin. I'll call his name out because he'd be happy if I shared the story. But in his first week, he emailed the global CEO. In his first week, he emailed the CEO of Asia Pacific. 2 weeks later, he was fast-tracked onto the leadership program. Like, he was like, I'm here and I'm going to make a dent. What do I need to do? You go back to, when we were growing up, I don't think millennials don't see barriers. They see opportunity, right? So I think there is a difference around not so much there's the language piece, but then there's the behavioral piece, right? So I think that if we had the opportunity to break down some of those norms and talk about them and share how we could be more collaborative and then be more powerful together, rather than one letting go of the ego or letting go of the power not being as powerful, I think we could shift that thinking. But it does require quite a lot of you know, hard conversations, right? Just like a big problem in this country is reconciliation. We find it difficult to have these hard conversations. Therefore, we just can't break through this problem. You know?
Yeah, but again, like gay marriage, I mean, like it was overwhelming that people didn't have a problem with that. It was like I don't know anybody that has a problem with reconciliation. I don't know anybody that has that problem. But it does seem to be that there's people in power. And then, but what they do is then they leave and they go, with climate change, oh no, we should definitely be doing that. As soon as they can say what they truly believe, rather than, so who's... You know, there's a driver that says, you must say this, but it's not what I believe, and it's not what anybody else believes. So why are you saying it? I don't understand that whole process of where, and if you don't have leadership, I mean, if you've got bad parents, it's very hard to raise your own children. I'm not saying that you can't. I mean, you look at it and you change. But if you've had good parenting all your life, it's a lot easier because you've had a long period of time to allow that, to have that thought process to come through. So the same thing with business. If you've got good business leaders that are passing down good information to the next group, you are going to get better collaboration. It has to start not at the top, but all the way through, from the bottom, the medium, and the top. You know, but if anyone stops that, then you're going to have issues. I mean, there's so many things that just don't make any common sense for people to drive. So we've got to be able to find those points that are connected. Now, that's pretty much our time, you know, and for the first time, I'm not going to leave an open question for someone to answer. I'm going to wind it up. But thank you very much, Warwick, for coming along. Very insightful. Thanks, Tony, Ronan. If you've got any questions, reach out. If you're innovative, if you've got want to be part of what Warwick's putting together, look, we'll put his details there and jump on. But thank you very much. And again, we'll see you next month. Or next week, sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Warwick.
Cheers, guys. Have a good arvo.